I'm Geraldo Rivera.
I'm Emily Campagno.
And I'm Eric Shawn. This is a Fox News Rundown.
Friday, December 16th, 2022. I'm Chris Foster. The first COVID-19 cases were reported in Wuhan, China 3 years ago this week, and we're still dealing with the fallout, including financially and politically.
We would hope that in a moment of this level of crisis, we could find some unity and get beyond that stuff, but the two sides clearly see this pandemic and the way that it's rolled out and the way that it was handled very differently.
We're speaking with Fox News Sunday host Shannon Bream.
I'm Jessica Rosenthal. Americans are gloomy about the economy, and some say the Fed needs to take its foot off the brake to avoid a downturn, even a recession, as officials try to tame inflation.
I think the Fed is being very much too tight, and I think that could lead to a poor economy into the future.
And I'm DeRoy Murdoch. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Biden administration's plan for a possible winter surge in COVID-19 cases includes another round of free masks, 4 per household by request, and continuing to encourage people to get the latest vaccines. And there's a report out from House Republicans saying there are indications the virus originated with biological weapons testing in China.
Our intelligence community has not been forthcoming with the American people about what was going on in that lab.
Kentucky House Republican James Comer on Fox, and they're promising more investigations when Republicans become the House majority next month. It was right around now, 3 years ago, when the first case clusters were reported in Wuhan, China.
Whether you look at mandates or masks or vaccines, people definitely fall down on either side of that, many times because of where they are politically.
Shannon Bream's the host of Fox News Sunday.
A lot of people feel like we've learned a lot, hopefully in the last couple of years, but we know a lot more scientifically about how to treat people, how to save lives, how to do a better job at this. So we have learned through the process, but I fear that as we look on Capitol Hill, there are still hearings. There will be more hearings to come. There are still accusations that it's very political in nature, when we would hope that in a moment of this level of crisis, we could find some unity and get beyond that stuff. But the two sides clearly see this pandemic and the way that it's rolled out and the way that it was handled very differently.
Yeah, there are mask recommendations. Again, in some cities, New York, LA, I know, maybe others. Now, Philadelphia public schools apparently have kids masking up and staff masking up for the first 2 weeks back from Christmas in case, people get it during Christmas gatherings, holiday gatherings. Mm-hmm. At least one New York State University campuses has people masked up now indoors. Now, things get really bad, like really bad. And you mentioned treatment's better now, but still, if things really, really explode this winter, it's going to be really tough to tell people now, you got to mask up inside again. Sorry. Even in places where people really went along with it back in the day, you're going to have business owners who aren't going to want to follow through or enforce it. And then you're going to get back to the thing where, retail clerks are going to get yelled at and have to deal with people who don't want to wear a mask or do want to wear a mask.
Yeah. And there's just a level of fatigue. I think people really in the beginning, most people were on the same page, like, let's do what we can to protect ourselves, our neighbors, the most vulnerable among us. Let's rise to the better angels among us. And I think after, almost 3 years of back and forth and people feeling like they weren't told the truth about things, that, these big agencies and big names like Walensky and Fauci and all these others change their positions on key issues. People there's been a loss of trust in public medicine and in public agencies in some ways that I think, if you come back to people now and say, okay, it's masks all the time inside for everybody, good luck enforcing that. I think enough people have said, I've got real doubts based on studies and based on what these medical leaders have told us over time, that's even really a definitive help. I just think that there are so many questions people have that they are now more willing to ask questions than just go along as they would have in the beginning when we were all cheering for each other and hoping for the best.
Yeah, it was also a lot scarier in the very beginning too. I mean, again, there's more. A lot of us are vaccinated. There are more treatments. That the Republicans are going to take the House next month, and that they're going to be, among other things, they're going to be looking at the COVID origins. They're going to be looking at the government response, people like Anthony Fauci. Now, there's this new report already from the Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee that says there are indications the virus spilled over from a biological weapons program. That contradicts an intelligence community report that came out last year that said there are no COVID links, or they couldn't find any COVID links to a bioweapons program. I'm not sure we're ever really going to know the truth given the secrecy of the Chinese government.
Exactly. And the fact that, by the time we did have any kind of outside investigative body admitted, it was months, if not a year into this. And China's never given full access to outsiders who wanted to come and ask these questions and look around. So I do think that people are going to be very open to hearing from these different investigations and potential theories because China was so tight-lipped about this and remains so. The interesting thing is that China domestically now has a real problem with this because they've tried to get to zero COVID, and we know just the barbaric lockdowns and limits and locking people in their homes and all of the things that we've seen, and probably some of it we don't know that hasn't been exposed. But the Western world looks at that and just says, okay, there is no way we're going along with that stuff. But there's just so much we're not going to know because China is able to control the flow of information with regard to the origins of this whole thing.
Yeah, in the end, it's, unless there are major leaks coming from somewhere, it's all going to be
speculative, at least partially,
and educated guesses. Moving on to some tech stuff. Now, the TikTok app might end up banned on federal government phones. That's already the case in some states over concerns about China and security. Now, a lot of kids are going to be really mad if this ever turns into an actual national ban. I mean, I'm sure eventually they'll move on to something else and they'll do their dances and stuff on some other app. President Trump sounded the alarm on this a couple of years ago and ultimately decided against a ban. And the Chinese say, look, there's nothing nefarious going on.
Well, and remember when he floated that during his administration, there was this complete meltdown, like Republicans will lose the entire next generation if you take TikTok away from these kids. I mean, there was a lot of consternation over that. I had Senator Mark Warner, a top Democrat, on a couple of weeks ago and asked him, okay, was Trump potentially right about this? And he's like, I think he might have been right and we should have been listening. And if we had taken action a couple of years ago, we might be in a better space when it comes to this now. Now, there are the measures that are aimed at keeping TikTok off government phones, whether state or federal, but there are other lawmakers who are actually trying to get it banned altogether. Like it just wouldn't be used in the domestic U.S. market. TikTok continues to say we don't hold data. It's not, in a way that it would be what we have in our U.S. market would be subject to Chinese oversight or to Chinese law. Lawmakers just aren't buying that anymore. And it's one of those few things, there's a lot of bipartisan agreement about this in Washington at a time when there's not much bipartisan agreement on anything, that there are real threats with TikTok. So I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to try to move forward on legislation. I mean, India is a country, for example, where it's banned altogether. Then there are a number of folks on Capitol Hill that seem to be trying to get that coalition together to do it here too.
Another thing that could be getting more bipartisan support in the new Congress is taking a harder look and taking a harder stance on cryptocurrency. Now, we've got this FTX guy in custody, Sam Bankman-Fried. His cryptocurrency exchange went belly up. There was the equivalent of a bank run. He says he made mistakes. Government says he stole. And, he's in custody now. I can't imagine either way that's going to be causing a lot of casual investors to go rushing into crypto.
And listen, I am such a Luddite when it comes to this stuff that it's a constant learning process for me about this crypto stuff. And I would say for a lot of our lawmakers too, I mean, Senate Banking Committee had a hearing on Wednesday where they called these folks in. The FTX CEO was there and others who talked about how this should be regulated. And it seemed to be that there was this line of thought, listen, you can't get rid of cryptocurrencies. It would be almost impossible to do that at this point. So the conversation has to be about how you regulate it. And I think that was one of the problems with Sam Bankman-Fried is that he was really trying to work around to ways of regulation that he thought would benefit him most or his company most. And this technology is developing so quickly that the law has not really been codified to catch up with it. But something of this massive nature that happens is what will spark that legislation and those regulations. And I think we saw in that Senate banking hearing on Wednesday that there is going to be a serious crackdown on cryptocurrency. Not that it won't exist. They seem to acknowledge, that ship has sailed, but in the way that it's going to be regulated now.
Yeah. And there are some lawmakers that want more regulation of social media as well. Getting back to that, Twitter, we have these Twitter files now where every few days we get these internal documents that come out that have been analyzed by journalists, and these internal documents with back and forth about what posts, what users to suppress. Now, the charitable explanation is that, look, these are human beings that are just trying to make decisions about moderation and how, in their terms of services, yada, yada, yada. And there are those, the less charitable explanation, there are those that say, look, there's government control of this stuff, and that might even rise the level of illegality.
I mean, yeah, you get into the situation where when a private company is acting at the direction of the government, I'm not saying that's what happened here with Twitter, but that legal theory, you turn that private company in some ways into a state actor, or they're acting on behalf of the government. So those are the questions people have. When we find out internally that there were weekly meetings at some point with top Twitter executives and the FBI, DHS, the DNI office, that sparks real questions about whether a government entity was directing the internal policies and actions of a private company. Because, you know, if you have somebody who is caught up in this so-called shadow banning, visibility filters, whatever they want to call it, that decides to bring a suit, I mean, that can be a theory for them that, listen, the government was acting through Twitter or causing them to act on behalf of quelling my free speech under the First Amendment. And I just think we're going to have a lot more, at least I do from what we've seen so far. I have a lot more questions than I do answers so far with what we've seen from Twitter. But if I'm somebody who feels I was wronged by these policies and these, you know, blocking them from trending or blocking their message from being, you know, out in the public sphere, I'd have real censorship thoughts. And that would be the person who would have standing to bring one of these suits.
Yeah. And President Trump's now unbanned. He's not on it for, I assume, business reasons because he's got his True Social going on. But now the decision to ban him, we've learned, was kind of made up on the fly, but it kind of had to be made up on the fly because a president had never done that before.
Yeah, they never banned a sitting head of state. So that was a whole conversation. Like, do we start kicking presidents and prime ministers off Twitter? How do we do that? And how do we try to carefully do that? And you can see there was angst internally. There were some people who thought, oh my goodness, we're getting into uncharted territory. We need to be very careful about how this goes down. And there were those who had real concerns that it would appear to be censorship in a way that may be pushing the line. So yeah, just to see these internal conversations is fascinating now.
Shannon Bream's the host of Fox News Sunday. If we don't talk next week, Shannon, happy birthday. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
This is DeRoy Murdoch with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Americans do not have the rosiest outlook ahead for the economy. The latest Fox News poll finds 81% rate the economy as only fair or poor. Nearly 3 in 4 voters say inflation has caused financial hardship for them over the past 6 months.
And folks are worried about next year, with 48% saying they think the economy will get worse and only 25% saying it will get better. This is important because when folks feel uncertain, they tend to spend less, and their forecast of tough times becomes reality.
Fox Business Network anchor Jerry Willis said a Deloitte survey also found corporate chief financial officers are largely not optimistic about the outlook for their own companies. Thursday, the Dow sunk more than 760 points after November retail sales showed up looking pretty weak. They were down 0.6% compared to October. Manufacturing output declined by that much as well, in the first drop there since June. Fox Business contributor Brian Brenberg said this, combined with the Fed rate hike announced this week, has Wall Street a bit spooked.
They are hating this retail sales number today, which dropped much more than expected. You put that on top of the Fed yesterday, and Powell's doing his best Paul Volcker impression, saying we are going to keep bringing rates up. Everybody's reading that as, this recession could get very real. Look, if consumers back off, and we're seeing a little bit of that now, that makes 2023 very, very scary.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said this week, while inflation at 7.1% was heading in the right direction, especially compared to the summer, and the housing market has cooled tremendously, the labor market is still just too strong.
One where we haven't seen much softening, where job growth is very high, where wages are very high, vacancies are quite elevated, and really there's an imbalance in the labor market between supply and demand. So that part of it, which is the biggest part, is likely to take a substantial period to get down.
The obvious question then is, what is a substantial period, as some disagree with the Fed's latest moves?
It's the recognition that the Fed is wrong again, unfortunately.
Gary Kaltbaum is the president of Kaltbaum Capital and a Fox Business contributor.
And you got to work it backwards. When the Fed printed $9 trillion, took rates to zero, and created all kinds of inflation and all kinds of bubbles. And then they fell behind. Interest rates, not them, but interest rates themselves themselves started to skyrocket without them, while they were saying inflation was transitory and there was nothing to worry about. Finally, they recognized that something had to be done, so they had to start playing catch up. They have to start raising rates. They have to stop printing money, and they slowly caught up. But something else happened at the same time is the economy hit a wall. And as you can see, I believe we're in recession already. Combine that with, if you look at two charts, one of savings rates, which are just absolutely plunging, and credit card usage is skyrocketing since the consumer's 70% of the economy, that's big time worry. So what's happened now, the actual market, remember, interest rates have now come down from 4.3% on the 10-year, and that's where mortgages sit, down to under 3.5%. But the Fed hasn't recognized that. So they keep raising rates into a big slowdown in the economy and a market that's telling them to slow down. And since the market, they're not listening to the market, you're seeing what the market's screaming about today. And I suspect there's going to be a bunch more to go to the downside as the market recognizes they're behind and the market recognizes earnings are going to head down, as well as the economy.
You know, after Fed Chairman Powell announced the rate hike, it sounded like, not that he was rooting for layoffs necessarily, but saying essentially that some layoffs, more than we're seeing, are needed in order to bring inflation back down to this close to 2%. That's obviously a very gloomy take, but how much more labor market cooling would be needed, especially since we have 10 million job openings right now?
Yeah, I think they're nuts, unfortunately. Neil Kashkari, another Fed head, the day after the Jackson Hole speech a couple of months back, the market dropped 1,000 points. And amazingly, one of our central bankers who supposedly cares about stability says, I'm happy the market dropped 1,000 points. And I'm thinking to myself, they're rooting for people to lose money and now lose jobs. These are our central bankers. That's worrisome. And yeah, they're actually rooting for it. And which is unbelievable and amazing. The media hasn't been ripping them on them. They seem to be Teflon as far as any criticism whatsoever. You don't want to see anybody lose jobs. And I have news for you. People losing jobs does not cure inflation.
Well, that's the point, right, Gary? That's the central question, is they're maintaining that not necessarily rooting for job losses, but that if the goal is to keep inflation at 2% and stop that suffering, stop that bleeding, then there needs to be sort of other bloodletting in another place.
And there's no historical evidence that in order to get rid of inflation, you got to kill the economy and kill the job market. I don't know where they get that idea from. We've had plenty of years, multi-years, where we've had a great economy, great jobs, and low inflation. Oh, gee, it was the few years before the last few years. So I don't know what they're thinking. My worry's been since Christmas of 18, there's just too much of them and not enough of us. If they would just leave the 200 and so million people that go to work every day wanting to do well for their family as well themselves, and let the markets be. I think the market is a lot more efficient than they are and their interference. And guess what? The 10-year yield again is back down to 3.4% and change. They're now sitting at 4.25%, 4.5%, and saying they're going to 5%. So they're kind of like stomping on the real market, and that's where I think the markets are worried, and that's why I think you're seeing what the market's doing here. And I do believe we're going to be going lower, unfortunately.
Others think the Fed is wrong, but think the wake-up call will come in the form of the strength of the American economy, and that Chair Powell will reconsider his tightness of today in the middle of 2023. Jeremy Siegel is a professor of finance at the Wharton School of Business.
Well, first of all, I am long run very optimistic. I think the Fed is being very much too tight, and I think that could lead to a poor economy into the future. However, I believe that they will come to the recognition that we need lower interest rates. They will eventually lower the interest rates, and that we could have a very good economy in the second half of 2023.
I was going to ask you about the timing of that. I've heard you say, and you just said it now, the Fed is sort of over tightening. It's basically too much, too fast. What are you seeing that is the current outcome or consequence of the too much tightening? Is it the housing market, for example, or is it something else?
Yeah, well, that's one of the factors, but I see inflation coming down everywhere and even becoming deflation in certain categories, specifically housing. Housing prices are going down and rental prices are going down. Now, not year over year, but month over month, they are going down. So when I hear Chairman Powell talk about, inflation is bad or worse than it was, I do not see that at all. And I believe that he's keeping interest rates too high. Listen, the Fed was to blame for the inflation we had with far too expansive monetary policy in 2020 and 2021. And then suddenly, Jay Powell, quote, got religion and, oh, my God, now, he's the biggest inflation fighter that we've ever seen. Inflation's under the tables, under the beds, in the closets, where, of course, in 2021, Chairman Powell said, inflation, it's transient, it's temporary, it's not anything permanent. So it's sort of the swing has gotten way too far. And, as a result, he is causing far more fluctuations in the economy than I think are warranted. I think our economy is inherently strong. I think the American system is inherently strong. I hate to see our central bank pursue policy that destabilizes the economy.
Now, when asked about rate cuts sometime in 2023, Chairman Powell said essentially no. Their focus is not on any cuts. What do you think? Because you're saying that's actually probably not going to happen, that they might have some sort of rude awakening. It
Yes.
sounds like Chair Powell is looking for some job layoffs. It sounds like he's looking at the job sector for that indication. Is there something else other than, an uptick in the unemployment or, an increase in unemployment that would serve as that rude awakening? So we don't have to get to the point where we have layoffs.
Well, I think we're going to have layoffs. And I wish I would say no, but I think the job market is going to weaken considerably. Part of it was, I think, a lot of firms overhired last year because there was such a shortage of labor, and they worried, and they took in a lot of people that haven't been as productive as they could have been. And that's one reason why productivity went down a record amount this year. I think a lot of them could actually get rid of some of those people that aren't working out as well. And that could be a signal to Chairman Powell that he does not need to tighten any further. That said, the Fed eventually gets it, if not on time or sooner. Later, I think the market is, beginning to tell them, listen, you're too tight. You're going to squeeze inflation into deflation, and you're going to turn what could be a good economy into a bad economy. That's what happens when yields on long-term interest rates go down the way they have. So he's not convincing the markets that his approach is right at all, in my opinion.
Finally, Professor, you are optimistic. What is this optimism based on? What are the fundamentals that you think make this a much stronger economy than maybe some of our leadership and even some of us are seeing? If Fox News polling has people feeling pretty gloomy, what would you point to and say, look, we're actually in better shape?
Well, again, I think that 2023 will turn out better once the Fed recognizes, and I think that they will, that they are too tight. I think one has to realize the inherent strengths of our market economy. I mean, you take a look around the world, look what's happening in China, unbelievable, crazy policy. I'm not even going to mention Russia. Elsewhere, look at Europe, overregulated. Despite our problems, we are still the heart of capitalism, and we're still where innovative people want to be. And we have an opportunity with some reform in our H-1B visa system to actually get the best and brightest from around the world. We've got to maintain that position.
Wharton Professor Jeremy Siegel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers. This weekend, wreath-laying ceremonies are planned across the country to remember fallen service members during the holiday season. One of the largest will be at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., where thousands of volunteers will lay the wreaths at the graves of each veteran there as part of the Wreaths Across America program. It started in 1992, and since then, more than 14 million wreaths have been sent to locations including national cemeteries and veterans memorials. This year, the story of the wreaths is taking on an extra layer of honor. In December of 2021, volunteers in Uvalde, Texas, worked to make sure all the veterans buried at Hillcrest Cemetery had a wreath on their grave, a big undertaking that took a lot of work. But after the May 24th school shooting at Robb Elementary that took the lives of 19 students and 2 teachers, the community put their wreath project for 2022 on hold. That's when volunteers from Alton, Illinois stepped in to make sure there were enough wreaths to honor not only their local veterans, but those buried in Uvalde, too. The U.S. Senate unanimously passed a resolution designating Saturday as National Wreaths Across America Day, and events are planned at more than 3,100 locations in all 50 states, at sea and abroad. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
Put the power of over 100 meteorologists and the worldwide resources of Fox in your hands with the Fox Weather Podcast. Precise, personal, powerful. Subscribe and listen now at foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary. Dr. Roy Murdoch. What's on your mind?
White flags are flapping in the breeze, thanks to Republicans willing to accept as permanent the emergency election rules that Democrats demanded during 2020's COVID hell. Longing for the elusive red wave, some GOP officials and operatives now suffer Stockholm Syndrome. They think it's time to surrender to Democrats, swallow their dodgy vote schemes, and eventually sink them with early mail-in and traffic ballots, drop boxes, ballots received and counted days and weeks after polls close, etc. Rather than switch, Republicans should fight. They have nothing less than federal law and the U.S. Constitution on their side. The GOP should litigate this matter all the way to the Supreme Court before ever yielding to Democrats' diabolical vision of how Americans should vote. Election Day is the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, not thanks to the Star-Spangled Banner or something that Thomas Jefferson quipped as he sipped Madeira. 2 federal statutes govern this matter. According to 2 U.S. Code Section 7, and I quote, "The Tuesday next after the first Monday in November in every even-numbered year," unquote, is the date for electing members of Congress and, quadrennially, per 3 U.S. Code Section 1, presidential delegates to the Electoral College. These laws specify November, not October or September. Neither statute allows for voting on Halloween or just after Americans leave the sand dunes on Labor Day. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania's absentee congressional vote started on September 16th, according to Vote.org. Kentucky's 2 days of early voting began on November 3rd. Connecticut allows neither in-person early votes nor no-excuse absentee ballots. Problem: these widely varied intervals deny voters equal protection under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. If Americans all voted on Election Day, as we overwhelmingly did from the days of Andrew Johnson through Lyndon Johnson until about when Obama arrived, voters and their ballots would enjoy something much closer to equal protection than today's confounding collection of conflicting voting windows. These objections aside, mass mail-in ballots, early voting, and all that are odious on their merits. Democrats should be ashamed of themselves. By seducing millions of Americans into voting at home rather than at precincts, Democrats have destroyed the sanctity of the secret ballot. Standing alone behind a curtain and picking one's polls at the polls is totally different from voting at the kitchen table or at an office vote party as family, friends, coworkers, or even employers hover judgmentally. Likewise, filling a mail-in ballot beneath the gaze of a visiting party hack trafficker demolishes secrecy. Early voting resembles a jury deliberating before hearing all the evidence. In Pennsylvania, 635,428 voters mailed in their ballots before Democrat John Fetterman's disastrous debate against Republican Mehmet Oz. Some voted as early as 39 days before Fetterman struggled to speak, a key senatorial skill. Those who wish to change their early ballots were out of luck. Rather than surrender to Mark Elias and the Democrats' other lawfare soldiers who cooked this dog's breakfast, Republicans need to lawyer up and litigate with all the passion that Thurgood Marshall brought to Brown versus Board of Education and others devoted to Miranda, Roe, Kelo, Dobbs, and other landmark cases. And if such litigation fails, then and only then should Republicans discuss beating Democrats at the filthy, illegal electoral practices that they've sicked on America's voters. I'm DeRoy Murdoch.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. And now, stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. Listen ad-free on Fox News Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts. And Prime members can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network, Fox News Rewind Financial Crisis 08. A look back at the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression.
The market is not functioning properly.
Subscribe now at foxnewspodcasts.com.